There are three big companies in the industry that have the power to command coverage whenever they make a move: AMD, Nvidia, and Intel. When one of these companies deigns make an announcement at another event, like last week's Computex, it's always huge news and dominates the coverage cycle for at least a full day or two. We see this at least once a year, though they'll often host their own launch events separately. Intel decided to start pushing X299 at Computex this year, right alongside AMD's X399, and we encountered a unique behavior. No one really watched the X299 coverage. We'll talk about why today. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by Corsair's new T1 race chair, which is a $350 gaming targeted chair using a bucket-style race seat. The chair arms have 4-directional movement for configuration to your liking, and as a bonus, they use rollerblade wheels. Learn more at the link in the description below. We already criticized Intel and its marketing language in our initial coverage of the X series CPUs. For example, when they used the phrases extreme megatasking in marketing slides or self-cannibalize their own product lines like the non-K-SKU parts, claiming that K-SKUs are required for VR gaming. That was all discussed, as was the requirement of the new X series CPUs for 12K gaming. We've talked about all that. But the coverage still did pretty well, and looking at the comments, most of you agreed with us, or if not agreeing directly with us, you were still voicing concerns about the new product line and about X299 and X series parts specifically, normally like Kaby Lake X, which we'll talk about in a separate video. So there's a lot of criticism going on with Intel right now, but still, you would expect follow-up coverage like X299 to do decently under any normal circumstances. And by normal, we're mostly looking at the past several years of product launches. But there's a few big differences this year from those previous launches, one of which, of course, is AMD's presence in the market now with CPUs especially, really shaking things up for Intel. So we're going to walk through some of that. There are a couple of other items that also we think affected the viability of coverage of X299 parts and caused us to change our publication priorities in the middle of Computex to make sure that the highest performing items were published first. One of the first videos we shot was our X299 motherboard coverage at Gigabyte's Suite, and that was prioritized for immediate publication because of the good viewership on our initial X series product announcement video. The video, the Gigabyte X299 motherboard walkthrough, only garnered around 12,000 views total since publication last week, and at first publication we were sitting at around 6,000 views when our then new Kingpin card teardown, which was a day older, was doing more than 30,000. It was doing significantly more per hour, which are all stats that we look at. And I need to provide some perspective on how we shoot a show like Computex to really make sure everyone understands what the process is like behind the scenes. So at Computex, we might shoot something like 4 or 5 videos in a day, maybe upwards of 6, but often tapers out around 4 or 5. And then we obviously have a limited amount of time left in the day for editing those videos and for getting them onto YouTube. So at that point, we face another challenge. How many videos do we push onto the YouTube algorithm before we lose faith in its ability to distribute them all and still get decent viewership across all videos? Because obviously you don't want to load everyone down with a whole bunch of videos all at once if YouTube's not actually going to distribute those and make sure there's even viewership. So that's a concern, as is time. So that means that we have to prioritize things. Now, going into a show, just leaning on experience for one, doing this for almost 10 years now, you lean on experience to figure out what should perform well, and you also look at trends in the industry, and part of this is looking at competition. So we might look at what other people that you watch are publishing and then decide from there, okay, these are doing well for them, these aren't doing well for them. We'll shuffle our priorities and make sure that the things that perform the best go up the soonest, because you need to make ROI on a really expensive trip, obviously. But you also want to make sure that you're covering stuff as a creator or a journalist or whatever early enough in the process that it's still relevant to everyone. In this trip, that seemed like it would obviously be X299, and as soon as we learned it was going to be at the show, X399. Those seemed like the very clear winners in terms of good viewership. And what happened was we actually ended up pushing cases ahead of X299, which I'll explain why in a moment, which cases always do pretty okay, but they do okay almost regardless of when we publish them, because cases just kind of have a really reliable and kind of predictable viewership where people will pick it up over time, whereas something like a new CPU or a new GPU has a really limited window where it's interesting to everyone and then it falls off because all the information available for the product has been disseminated up until the point where you just are waiting for a review to get more information. So going into the show expecting X299 to perform well meant that we encountered something a bit different than expected. Obviously, we have case coverage that did better than X299 videos. We even had a vlog do 2 times more views than some of our X299 videos, and we never do vlogs. And our content was exactly in line with all of our other coverage, so that wasn't it either. As soon as we were able to get Gigabyte to let us film the X399 board, we ran over there, got the video shot and online within an hour or so of filming it, and that content piece has now done double of what the Gigabyte X299 video did, published a bit before the X399 video, and the 399 video was only one motherboard. Here's a look at some of the view stats for X299 and X399, the public numbers. This gives an idea for the popularity trend between them and shows us something that we started noticing for Intel earlier this year. Their new stuff just isn't as popular. That started with Kaby Lake and it's continuing here, and we think that's for a few reasons. And before rolling into those, just to kind of give some more context, this video is supposed to help you understand, one, what we kind of look at behind the scenes when we're making content, just because it's kind of interesting, but two, look at why X299 is just not that popular for this coverage cycle compared to normally. In fact, it was bad enough that originally our plan was everything X299 and what we could get of X399 when we learned it was there goes up first. And as soon as that first Gigabyte X299 video hit, I told Keegan, okay, all that stuff I said about X299, forget it. It waits till the end of the show. We'll publish Cooler Master first. We'll publish the MSI laptop stuff first. All the other videos you saw on our channel, those moved ahead of the MSI X299 coverage that was published later, Asus 299, and whatever else we may have talked about, to the point where we ended up, as soon as Gigabyte X399 went live, doubling down on 399 as fast as possible because we saw the viewership was quite good. So the reason for that, I think there's a few theories here that are valid for this. One of them is that I think people might just be bored of Intel, and the reason for that is because you look at Intel's performance over the last several years, this is not news to anyone, they generally have a pretty predictable performance leap of maybe 5 to 7% in something like gaming, FPS. Maybe you get some more out of single-threaded performance or some really specific application. But for our audience, you're expecting 5, 7%, certainly not any more than 10 when overclocking and things like that. So for that reason, it's easy to see why people might be bored of Intel, because they might just expect, well, I know the performance of X99 and its CPUs, so I can kind of figure out what X299 and its CPUs will look like as well. That's one potential reason. This might be contributing to the limp viewership in X299, where everyone sort of thinks they know what to expect, which is valid. And then the other end of the possible theories of why performance is lower on 299 versus almost everything else is that AMD has been stealing some of Intel's thunder lately. Intel has not had to compete in a long time. In fact, I think that they have forgotten how to compete in some ways. You look at the recent marketing materials for the upcoming CPUs, that kind of tells you why. But AMD is now putting pressure on them in multiple markets, and the main one that's interesting for now is Threadripper, because suddenly HEDT is challenged, and Intel hasn't faced that for a very long period of time at this point. And so the big thing there is that because Intel is being challenged, it means that viewership is going to be more split. People have a finite amount of time to watch things. If they're interested in AMD and X399, they might not watch Intel and X299. They are not necessarily mutually exclusive or crossover audiences. So that's part of the challenge too. This coverage, the viewership of the coverage, I should say, is being pulled away from Intel in some of these markets. And to be fair, Threadripper looks quite interesting for this one versus HEDT from Intel. So we're definitely, I mean, we'll be testing and reviewing both. Stay tuned for all that. But it's a pretty clear path that they're going down in terms of competition between the two companies. Now, another thing that we saw that's interesting and kind of potentially hurts or helps AMD, it's hard to tell exactly depending on what you're posting as a creator or journalist or reporter. And that one other thing is we saw a few comments where people would ask things like, and it's completely fair to ask, didn't X399 just come out? Why are you talking about X299? And that's where it's interesting, because AMD decided clearly to name their processors or their chipsets things that were somewhat relatable to Intel's incumbent devices. So with chipsets, you get X399. Clearly, it's after X299. Intel wasn't going to use it anyway, because if you look at their naming schemes, 58, 79, 99, and they're going to skip 100 and go to 299. So they'll probably go to 499 would be the next guess, but not use 399. So AMD took that spot, and then AMD also did their X370 and their B series boards that are similar in naming and number, especially to Intel's B series boards. So it creates some interesting confusion, but also means that AMD immediately has a part in the market where people can look at it, knowing Intel for 5 years now or more, knowing Intel stuff, they can look at AMD and say, I understand what that is and where it falls in the product stack and how it should perform and what features it should provide based on my knowledge of these other things that I've been using for years. So that makes it easy to make a linear transform sort of between one company and the other. But it also means that for newcomers to the market, they have a challenge of, I don't know what any of this stuff means. I haven't built a system in 7 years or whatever. So 399 looks like it's the newest, it's the highest number. It's in the X series. Why are we talking about X299? So that's one thing that's potentially helping AMD. It could also hurt their viewership though, because we had to specifically use the word Threadripper in either thumbnails or titles to make sure that people didn't confuse the two. We didn't want people, for example, seeing X299 Intel coverage and expecting all X blank 99 to be Intel if they were actually interested in AMD. So you have to make sure there's not a chance to misread one very important number in the title and skip the video because they don't want to see it because they're not interested in Intel. So you name it X399 Threadripper or put the title in the thumbnail or something like that. So there's all really interesting stuff. It's kind of a behind the scenes look. The biggest thing I wanted to point out was that for the first time in a very long time, we're seeing really interesting performance metrics in terms of views, where a for sure guaranteed high view count item, a motherboard and a new platform launch and a new CPU launch, is not necessarily the best performing thing. There's one outlier here. Our delidding coverage of the 7900X was by far our best coverage from the show, but that had a few things going for it. One, we delidded a processor that's not released, so that helps a lot. Two, we had Der Bauer in the video, featuring Der Bauer in the title. That helps bring in viewership. And then three, we criticized Intel for the TIM usage, kind of questioned why solder isn't used, spoke to Der Bauer, certainly an expert in it. So that also gets interest. So that's the outlier where, okay, it's a much different type of content than anything else that we shot at the show, so it'll perform well. But the other stuff, not so much. I mean, I have view numbers here. Asus X299, 8,500 views as of this filming. MSI X299, 7,100. Gigabyte X299, and this is the interesting one because we shot 2 gigabyte things, was about 12,000. Gigabyte X399, 20,000. And Asus X399, 21,000. So for Asus, that's 8,500 to 21,000, and both of them were one motherboard featured, and they were both flagships. Gigabyte was 12 to 20,000 as of right now, and the Gigabyte one was a roundup of all their X299 boards versus the one 399. And to be fair, that was somewhat exclusive when we first filmed it because we were just among the earliest to see the board, but you get the idea. So I think that kind of gives a behind the scenes look. It's two parts to this video. One, you got a behind the scenes look at how we do these conventions because we don't normally talk about it. I don't think a lot of people do. You're so focused on getting the content out. You don't really care to talk about how you're getting the content made and how you prioritize things and things like that. But two, it also shows that there's a pretty interesting market brewing between Intel and AMD, where Intel now is facing the normal level of criticism for things that they do, but they're also facing some heat because AMD can come in and take advantage of those criticized aspects of Intel's HEDT line. As I said in the news announcement for X299 and the new CPUs, the X series CPUs, Intel should have, if they had the opportunity to, doubled down on things like the 7700K, which they are still uncontested there for people who want the highest possible FPS gaming platform. If you're doing 144 hertz or something, they have competition, but it's not as good as the 7700K. And they start struggling once you look at production, as we talk about in all the reviews. Or double down on the G4560, where they're also doing really well because AMD has no R3 yet, and the R3 might not be as cheap as the 4560. Instead, or I guess one more alternative, fix the i5 line so that it makes more sense price-wise and performance-wise. Instead, what they've done is double down on HEDT, because that stuff was all made. Silicon normally is made for about 18 months by the time you buy it, or in the process of being made, I should say. They doubled down on that, and now they're facing Threadripper, which is what Ryzen performs well in. So, interesting market. Let us know your thoughts below on all of this and why you would prioritize watching one video versus another. Like if I gave you an option and we put X299, X399, and a case video in front of you and you can watch two, which two do you watch right now if you only have time today? So that's what I'm curious about. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. We post some articles on there sometimes that are Patreon only, where you can see some of this behind the scenes stuff more directly in a direct written form to the Patreon backers. Store.gamersnexus.net to grab a shirt like this one, and subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.